Great. Well, thanks to everyone for coming out for the 18th annual Norman R. Seay Lecture. My name is John Morris, and I'm the co-director of the Knight Alzheimer Disease Research Center, and the Knight ADRC is sponsoring the Seay Lecture. Mr. Seay was an icon in St. Louis for his civil rights advocacy and his deep commitment to education. And he was the inaugural chair of the Knight ADRC's African American Advisory Board, which started in the year 2000. And he was a wonderful chair, recruited wonderful people, and they still advise us today. In 2006, Mr. Seay had a small stroke and left him with a little bit of difficulty speaking, a little bit of dysarthria. So he didn't want to be the chair of the board any longer. He remained on the board, but he passed the chairmanship to other people. And when he stepped down, we decided to host this Seay lecture in his honor. And we've had it, as I say now, this is the 18th year. Mr. Seay was right up front and talked to each Seay lecturer as they came through and asked them questions. He did pass in 2019, so we miss Mr. Seay, but he still is with us in spirit. So, as I said, my name is John Morris. I have some duties as the moderator. Number one duty is to ask you all to turn off your devices, please. Number two, for those of you who parked in one of two garages, the Metro Garage and the North Garage here on campus, there is parking validation, and they will help you outside at that entrance desk to get your validation ticket. For matters of housekeeping, if you go out either of the two doors into the lobby and turn that way, you'll find the restrooms. And your program has a QR code. We would very much appreciate if at the end of the Seay lecture today you would use that to complete an evaluation of the Seay lecture. Putting on a lecture of this sort takes a great many people. I thank everyone in the Knight ADRC for their efforts. I'm going to mention four people who really did the lion's share of the effort to organize and produce this Seay lecture: Jennifer Phillips, Andre Denny, Dottie McDowell, and perhaps most of all, Murtis Spencer. Will you join me in giving them a round of applause? Now, after today's lecture, we're not finished here in the Eric P. Newman Education Center, because all day tomorrow and half a day on Wednesday, we are also hosting the National Conference Enhancing Participation by Minoritized Groups in Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementia Research. And we're very pleased that, as our preceding conference in 2018, we have representatives from many people interested in Alzheimer's disease, and particularly representatives from each of the 37 funded Alzheimer's disease research centers. On Wednesday morning, we particularly would like members of the St. Louis community not only to attend the conference, but to participate so that we can get your ideas about how the Alzheimer's disease research community can best partner with community members and organizations. I want to give thanks also to our Seay Lecture Planning Committee. It's composed of individuals from the African American Advisory Board, including the chair, Doug Petty, Arlene Moore Ross, Richard L. King, and Joy Ballsbury, in addition to Andre Denny and Murtis Spencer. Please give them a round of applause. And finally, I want to thank the St. Louis, Missouri chapter of the Lynx Incorporated. Many of you know that the Lynx is a national organization of 14,000 professional women of color in 283 chapters around the United States. We have been partnering with the St. Louis chapter of Links Incorporated for several years, and they have been very generous, and part of their generosity is going to be, again, to host a reception following today's Seay lecture. I would like to ask Dr. Kay Roster, president of the St. Louis, Missouri chapter, to come up here so I can present a plaque. This is called a photo opportunity.
How are you? It is good to see you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for what you do. You want to take this? All right. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Jin-Moo Lee, professor and chair of the Department of Neurology here at Washington University, provide some opening remarks. Dr. Lee, after he got his bachelor degrees in molecular biophysics and biochemistry at Yale, got his MD and PhD degrees from Weill Cornell Medical College, then did a neurology residency at the University of Pennsylvania, and following that came here to Washington University to do a postdoctoral fellowship with then head of neurology, Dennis Choi. After he completed the fellowship, he remained on the faculty and has risen through the ranks. He is an exemplary physician scientist. He is very interested in clinical aspects of stroke and cerebral vascular disease, and his research explores the cellular and molecular aspects of stroke and neurodegenerative diseases. In addition to all of his scientific and clinical accomplishments, he's an amazing mentor and recently received from Washington University the Distinguished Faculty Award for Research Monitoring. So if you would join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Jin-Moo Lee.
Thank you, John, for that really kind introduction. And I want to welcome all of you here to Washington University in St. Louis for this 18th annual Norman R. Seay lectureship. We're joined by a large local contingent, but also we're joined by representatives from throughout the country. And I warmly welcome you to St. Louis. Thank you for coming. This year, the lecture is the kickoff event for the ADRC conference entitled Enhancing Participation by Historically Minoritized Groups in Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementia Research. We're very excited about this special event, which will address critical issues in diversity, equity, and inclusivity in Alzheimer's disease research. The Knight ADRC, under Dr. Morris's leadership, has been committed to issues of DEI for more than 2 decades. And as Dr. Morris mentioned, in 2000, Norman Seay was named the inaugural chair of the African American Advisory Board for the Knight ADRC. In 2006, after he had a small stroke, I had the honor of taking care of him right after that period. And I remember him being such a humble and kind gentleman, such an honor to take care of him. He, after stepping down as chair, the lectureship was initiated. And this year, we're greatly honored to have Angela Hill as the Norman Seay lecturer, and we'll be hearing more about her from Dr. Morris, who will be giving a formal introduction. But once again, I welcome all of you to Washington University in St. Louis as we launch this exciting program. Thank you, and welcome.
So it is my great honor now to introduce Angela M. Hill. She is professor and chair of the Department of Pharmacotherapeutics and Clinical Research, as well as associate dean of clinical practice at the Taneja College of Pharmacy at the University of South Florida. She received her Doctor of Pharmacy from the Florida A&M University and was on the faculty at Florida A&M for almost 20 years until 2017 when she became a tenured professor at University of South Florida. Her research and her practice both address health and social support needs of underserved populations, not only in Florida, but much more broadly, and she has done work in this regard in Nigeria. She is the project manager for the entity Workshop Enhancing Community Advocacy Research and Education, or WeCare. And the mission of WeCare is to close the gap of healthcare disparities by being a resource for education on health issues that plague diverse populations. She also, in addition to all of this, has pioneered pharmacy services for memory disorders clinics, and so is very much interested in neuroscience in general and Alzheimer's disease in particular. I can't tell you how delighted we are to welcome Professor Hill to Washington University. And Angela, if you will come here, there's another photo opportunity. Jinmu, if you would join us. I got my stuff out of the way. And who's our photographer? Marissa? This reads 18th Annual Norman R. Seay Lecture, October 2nd, 2023, presented in appreciation to Angela M. Hill by the Charles F. and Joanne Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So please congratulate Dr. Hill.
Thank you.
I've never received an award before giving my presentation, so thank you. That was a first. I can't reiterate how much a pleasure it is to be here this afternoon. First of all, let me bring you greetings from the state of Florida. And I want to thank all of you for arranging me to have such nice weather since I arrived last night, reminiscent of Florida. But I too echo my gratitude towards the planning committees, Dr. Morris. Everyone has just been so hospitable, and I just have really felt like a VIP. And today it is just such an honor to just share with you from a pharmacist's perspective, you know, what I feel is such an important discussion as we talk about strategies to really think about marginalized populations and how we're going to make sure they don't get lost in the shuffle as we move down this path of treating Alzheimer's patients and those with related dementias. I have nothing to disclose. I gain nothing from this talk except hopefully just sharing with you some of the work I've been able to do with the Alzheimer's Association and some of the other community-based organizations, the Bird Neuroscience Institute and tons of long-term care facilities and other entities that have allowed me as an academician but pharmacist to share and develop my expertise. So I think probably some main points that I want to just kind of reiterate, remind, or sing to the choir, so to speak, just let's revisit where we are in regards to clinical trial participation and why is it so important that we have to have this discussion today as a launch to the next 2 days and what we're going to hear about from others in the field in the fight. And we have to talk about the clinical as well as the economic implications of what new therapies and advancing research are going to do for patients that we don't even know about. So we've got to talk about that. And I've had the pleasure for now, I'm celebrating 28 years of working in various practice areas where I'm seeing, unfortunately, the impact of the disease. So this is so important that we talk about these different impacts. But I also want to let you know that there are community-based initiatives that we're doing in Florida that we're really proud of. We don't claim to own the patent on it, but I just want to share a little bit about what we're doing to try to curve that, I guess, come around the corner in regards to making sure that we don't leave people behind. So as was mentioned, and as you can tell in the announcement, you know, my journey has been very varied, starting out in the mental health sector, transitioning over after some postgraduate training to the neuroscience world. And around that time, I had 2 grandparents that were unfortunately diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So I stand before you today as a professional who's worked in it, but also as the product of what could possibly mean my future right? So I had a paternal grandmother and a maternal grandfather. So I just want that to kind of sink in, and what does that mean in terms of my possible future? So that was, again, between let me see, he told me I gotta go back. That was between me at University of Florida and going back to Tallahassee, where they were diagnosed. And at that time, when I think about the treatments that were available, as I was sharing with Dr. Morris earlier today, I don't recall there being a mention of Tacrin or donepezil as a part of their treatment armamentarium, certainly no mention of clinical trials. You know, and so as I transitioned and started joining some of the other entities, I discovered that Alzheimer's disease isn't something that just happens to people by itself. They have a whole host of other things. And so my job security was established early on, because while the specialists were focusing on the neurology side of it, I was able to actually kind of be the glue for a whole lot of work that other health professionals had done. And I embraced what geriatric syndromes mean. You know, the average aging individual, unfortunately, can look forward to having decline in health. And it may manifest in many, many different ways. But the cost of someone having a fall is somewhere around $63,000 minimum by the time they're hospitalized. When you think about the cost of just hearing aids, $4,000 or $5,000 right off the bat, right? So we have to put this in a socioeconomic standpoint. So as a pharmacist, I approached my work with aging patients in general, but those that were dealing with neurological disorders as it must be my responsibility to make sure we get the right drugs and as few as possible, and that we don't complicate the cognitive aspects that go along with Alzheimer's disease. And as the disease progresses, I have to even be more intentional about reminding the neurologists and the psychiatrists and everyone involved that some of these things can affect sleep, or they can affect appetite. And as these patients are developing incontinence and other medical problems, the selection of medications becomes crucially important, and that the neurologist can't be the only person treating the patient. The nurse can't do it by themselves. We're going to all have to work together, and what that meant and what that looked like. So I was just fortunate to be a part of 3 of our 17 memory disorder clinics in the state, and I had some wonderful mentors along the way. And I'd like to introduce you to one of my first ones, an Ecuadorian neurologist who was one of 7 that I worked with in Tallahassee, who actually had study staff, and he did clinical trials, industry-sponsored trials, and he trusted me to be his pharmacy consultant for several studies. My first one was with Zantac, when it was being transitioned from prescription to over-the-counter. And so we gave a whole lot of people a whole lot of chili all throughout the day and hot sauce, and my job was to monitor how many times they reported having heartburn, and then I got to give them over-the-counter Zantac. But over the 15 years I had a chance to work with him, we also, because I was working with the Alzheimer's Resource Center at the time, we started a memory disorder clinic. And they hadn't planned for a pharmacist, but I was on the board, and so I kind of knew it was going to happen. So I volunteered to counsel patients in the waiting room before the neurologist came, because the office only had room for the neurologist, and then the nurse, the social worker, and the cognitive testing. So I said, I'll just sit in the waiting room, and before the neurologist comes, I'll see the patient. And so before I left Tallahassee, I would see patients that had 5 medications, 15 medications. The highest was 25 when I left. It gets better, it gets better. Got to University of Florida, and I remember seeing a patient that had 34 unique medications. So just imagine how daunting that is, right, for the neurologist and all the other disciplines to have to see. So again, my job security was there from the front. So with Dr. Ayala, we did a lot of studies. He was one of the leading pediatric neurologists in the Big Bend of the state. So Tallahassee's right on the other side of the bend, right? And so people were coming far and near. But between Tallahassee and Pensacola, Tallahassee and Jacksonville is a whole lot of rural area. Okay, and so our memory disorder clinic was tasked to do community outreach to our touch counties, and we had 8 of them. And so I was able to, in working with him, work with epilepsy, multiple sclerosis studies, but he also had the early versions of the Alzheimer's vaccine trials. And I was able to be that blinded pharmacist that actually helped educate the patients. And at that time, in my naivety, I wasn't a part of the marketing or the recruiting or anything, but I was aware of what the clinic coordinators had to do. And what I noticed is that there weren't any people that looked like me coming in for these studies. In Tallahassee, we don't have a large Hispanic population either. And so this was kind of concerning, but I remember having conversations about why aren't we having African Americans? Why aren't we getting diversity in here? And some of the things that were shared at the time was that, some of it, they just didn't meet the qualifications, there wasn't interest, they weren't aware, nobody knew, not to mention some of the other things. And so I would ask, what are you doing? And it was simple. Dr. Ayala would tell the coordinator would reach out to a few doctors, they built a database of patients that they knew might be interested. Sometimes they spent a little money on some flyers, things like that, but nothing really intentional that resulted in anything meaningful. So years passed, and I move on, and then I started to appreciate, excuse me, a little bit more about Alzheimer's disease, because by then my grandparents had passed on, and I'd worked in the clinic for a number of years, and I started appreciating what it meant in terms of who was affected. And you read the literature and you'd hear about, or sometimes patients would say, well, that doctor didn't make me feel so comfortable. And I started appreciating what structural racism meant in healthcare delivery. And at the top of this slide, it's kind of busy, but it kind of shows the percent of different marginalized populations and how many of them were dealing with discrimination, though it wasn't talked about to the level that we talk about it today. When you look at some of the other statistics, how much money was being spent, and certainly how many aging people were getting Alzheimer's disease, et cetera. And long before COVID, these numbers were starting to grow. COVID just came and unfortunately took things exponentially by the time we realized just how the virus works and affects brain processes. And so, I was working by this time, as these numbers, because this is kind of dated now, but I was working at the Bird Neuroscience Center, and Dr. Morgan would talk about a cure. Oh, a cure is on the way. A cure is on the way. By 2020, we're going to have a cure. How many of us in here heard that said, right? We're going to have a cure. And we were all excited and all pumped up and all ready for it, and didn't happen. It's 2023. We still don't have a cure, but we're on our way. So when we look at what does this mean economically for Alzheimer's patients, it means that we need the researchers in the room to remain inspired, motivated, and intentional about creating opportunities for us to get to the level of a cure, because there are economic impacts. And what this slide shows is that if we can figure out a way between now and 2050, we could save a whole lot of money, roughly, over $200 billion, right, in terms of healthcare costs. But think about quality of life. So as I mentioned to you, my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease. She ended up in a nursing home, but I remember the day. She knew who I was, but she didn't know my name. And you can't put a price tag on what that means in terms of quality of life. You can't quantify that, right? But if I could have that moment before that back. But I can't. So I need the researchers, I need you researchers to keep doing it. When we look at what's coming down the pipeline and we compare it to Alzheimer's disease to other disorders, we see, unfortunately, Alzheimer's disease is in the top 5 when we talk about how many medications are being researched, right? Second to cancer and cardiovascular disease. We have a lot of medications in the pipeline, but I've been hearing for 10 or 15 years we have 120 some odd drugs being evaluated, right? Now we have a lot more. But it's kind of like, well, who are they being tested in? So there's a lot of work being done, but we still aren't there. We still aren't there. Now, the downside, I'm going to show you a little later slide that shows that the funding isn't up to par in terms of what we need to kind of come around that curve either. But more importantly, this points out that the participation in terms of diverse, just in the African American population, we're not getting it. Now, the African American population is a small sect of the overall US population. But I want to share with you part of the reason why I say diversity is needed is because of the overall impact. So when we talk about these dollars, I want to kind of paint a picture about what it really means and why diversity is really, really, really needed. Because depending on where you live in the United States, it might just look a little different. And I know I've had a lot of conversations with individuals I met with today about the demographic makeup in Texas compared to Florida. And so we might have a little bit more going on as it relates to Hispanics, but then I learned that no, you have pockets of them in places, and it's just how do we get to them? And again, that's why we're partially here for these next few days. So this is a snapshot from the FDA where they looked at it to kind of see, well, who's actually participating? And what we're noticing when you look at this graph is still we're hitting predominantly females under age 65 that are Caucasian. So there's still a lot of room for us in terms of trying to diversify who's coming to trials. And so this means doesn't mean that others aren't participating, it just means that the majority of people that are participating are Caucasian females. So no disrespect to Caucasian females, it's just that we need to find out, right, about how these medications are going to work in other populations and other ethnic groups so that we can really dampen the economic impact. So these two slides, very busy, but what I want you to appreciate with the colors is that over here, this compares 2010 to 2020. And what we see is the density of the Hispanic population. You see the color changes. And so this is kind of a prediction of what it looked like back in 2020. That seems like so long ago. But what it tells you is that we're going to have an exponential growth in this demographic that we need to be mindful of. The other thing is over here when we look at African Americans, now this data is from 2010. One, you can appreciate where the majority of African Americans are, right? And then when you look at the density, the other thing that I want you to get out of this is that we're still only talking about 13% of the overall population. So as we, kind of think about why we're having this conversation, because these are the two groups, that are most affected by this disease. So we have to pay attention to the growth patterns of this group because that's going to be very telling. So the other reason is as we do these trials, we really need the diversification before the drugs get to the market so we don't have recalls. Recalls cost us a whole lot of money. But it's at the expense of quality of life for humans in general. And unfortunately, we lose the public trust when we have to do things like recall therapies. And when we don't know things before a drug gets to the market, really they don't trust that we know what we're up to. What was all this money being spent in research and we don't know? But it's interesting that less than 50% of Americans know anything about trials. Now, everyone in this room, we're exceptions to the rule, right? But it tells you that there's probably 5, 6 other people within our reach that have no clue what a clinical trial is doing. Whose responsibility is it? Whose fault is it? We have more work to do, right? And so that's what brings me again here today. Now, what should happen is that consumers should be able to go to the healthcare providers and find all that they need to know. Is it happening? How many times have you went to the doctor recently and they suggested you have a clinical trial or participate in a clinical trial, right? Now, it's not all their fault. It's not all their fault. It just means we have to kind of bridge the two together. And so the other thing that is happening in terms of barriers is we have socioeconomics, we have geographic areas. Everyone's not fortunate to have a WU near them, or a University of South Florida. And so we have to figure out how to get to the people that are in desperate need, right? And so there's a ton of barriers as to why people don't participate, but as was mentioned, in my community engaging work, we do a lot of qualitative studies and focus groups to figure out the why. And some of what we're being told is, you know, it ranges sometimes from interest to just pure mistrust, to never was offered, to medical ineligibility, which was something, again, that occurred quite a bit when I was in North Florida. You know, they can't leave their jobs to go participate in a trial. They can't sacrifice 2 or 3 hours. You know, there's other priorities, and some of it, again, is access because they may be living in an area too far from a center actually doing a trial. And then there's just plain old social determinants of health, you know, meaning that I need to keep the lights on, I need to make sure we have food to eat. And unfortunately, you know, just based on impressioning, maybe from parents, from loved ones, from family members, et cetera, I have certain perceptions about whether or not I should do this. So how do we overcome these kind of barriers? Again, these are core 2 groups we need to look at. We're not even talking about others that are affected by the disease. But certainly these 2 groups, when you look at the risk factors associated with ADRD, these 2 groups bring it to the table, right? They bring the strokes, you know, as Mr. Seay himself experienced, unfortunately. And sometimes when we have certain risk factors, they then move beyond the point where we can actually make a meaningful difference in regards to cognitive rebound. You know, and so these are, again, some of the things that we have to think about. So when we have a group that's twice as likely or 1.5 times as likely, we have to be very intentional about trying to reach them. And there's predictions that even though these are, these percentages look very low, what we notice is that small sect of the population, but a growing number of patients, unfortunately, being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and we see this number almost tripling between now and 2060. So we have to get ahead of the train in terms of targeting those that are most affected by the disease, and based on statistics, we're way behind in terms of that. And so how have we been doing it? Well, yes, sir. Yes.
There's some beautiful music playing over here.
Okay. I hear it. I wonder. Not sure. Let me make sure it's not. Yeah, it's me. I don't know what was happening yesterday. I'm glad you heard it. I was thinking, oh wow, I'm getting an award. I'm getting music. This is really good. This is good. I do apologize. I do apologize. But to bring us back to where I was going, how have we been treating this disease? Well, I was saying, when I first came out of pharmacy school, Tacrin and Aricept were there to greet me. Nobody was really impressed by them. The medical community wasn't, but it was better than not having anything, right? So we kind of, created this thing of symptomatic. It's just gonna slow the car down, not gonna really do much, not gonna replace what's lost, but we're gonna slow progression down. Again, then now, we're in this era where we've learned a little bit. We know a little bit more about pathology, right? And what's happening. It wasn't we didn't know if it was the chicken or the egg when we looked at biological markers, right? Back in the early 90s when I came out of school, now we know. We understand also, though, that as the disease progresses, sometimes we have to treat what may be, those behavioral and psychiatric disturbances that patients can have. So when they're having hallucinations or they're depressed, right? So we treat it in different ways. But again, these patients don't just have ADRD, they have other comorbid issues. So again, the reason I had the job security is because I could focus also on these other tangential issues while we're addressing some of these types of approaches. Now, when we look at what we're doing in terms of research, 80% of the research, I think the numbers are about 82% of it, is focusing on disease modification with attention beyond just cholinergic mechanisms, just replacing, acetylcholine. We're looking at a whole bunch of other things. But we also are creating what might be and I heard the term earlier today, said a cocktail approach, right, to addressing patients with disease so that we may actually kind of arrest the disease. Now, what I realize consumers are doing, and I think part of it is desperation, part of it is frustration, and part of it is just naivety. They're resorting, and not waiting on the research, they're resorting to things like ginkgo. And they're hearing about Huperzin A. And they forced me to develop a subspecialty in herbals and alternative medicine. Because as I went out in the community and we did health fairs and we did information, I'd have people with ginseng in their pocket and they'd be taking Focus Factor and Prevagen. And we've seen the commercials, right? Because they were not told or offered the opportunity to have a clinical trial, but instead they were seeing the direct to consumer advertising on TV and more willing to take those unknown products, right? Then we had the emergence of medical foods. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with some of those, but a lot of things being done to try to help a disease where we realized the damage had been done long before the symptoms even showed up. So do you know how much money was being spent and thrown at those kind of products? So when I told you about the patient taking 34 medications, how many of them you think were vitamins and nutraceuticals? 20. So job security for me, nonetheless. But I had to stay on top of my game. So what have I said so far is basically the disease-modifying agents have taken us to a stage where we're arresting the disease, slowing it down. We still have some things we got to work out. But we're doing a little bit more in terms of slowing the progression than what we were doing with just the symptomatic approaches. And certainly, it is better than nothing. And one of the things we've learned is that when we stop treatment, people advance much quicker, and they may or may not respond to therapy when reintroduced, right? So again, getting the right medication to the patient at the right time is important. And then there's always this economic impact, right? And so again, if we can progress the disease, if we can even progress the onset of symptoms, what I think our disease-modifying drugs are doing is taking us in this era of almost prevention. If we can figure out the right time to introduce the medication. Based on what we know now. So I'm not standing claiming to be a diagnostician or anything, but I've been around just a little bit to know some of the things that come into play as we're evaluating patients. And so our goal had traditionally been, if we can delay institutionalization, if I can get that day before back where my grandmother forgot my name, if she can maintain independence and stay in her home and not have to be institutionalized, if she could, unlike my grandfather, stay home alone and not require care in the house, she ended up in the nursing home, but he ended up, because my mom couldn't afford that, staying at home, and she paid people to come and watch over him, 24/7 care, right? If we can delay onset or we can delay progression, it would make a meaningful economic impact, particularly because now we know a little bit more. So I like to put the challenge out there that we need to just really figure out when we need to introduce these drugs so they can truly, bless you, have a preventative effect as well as, preventing some of the issues. Because what we know now is that, yes, these biological markers tell us a lot, but they might actually start being produced or evidence in the brain early on. So I told you, my grandfather and my grandmother had it. What does that imply for me, both genetically and otherwise? It means that I have to have a handle on my lifestyle practices, right? My diet, and a whole bunch of other things, because I may be already wired and may have already passed those genes on to my daughter unknowingly and unintentionally. And so this is why we have to pay attention to these things. The medications that we have been given so far are given at this phase, when symptoms emerge. But this is the point at which we can probably make the most meaningful difference and even here. So this is our mindset. This is a major shift from when I first got out of pharmacy school. We didn't really know all of these kind of things. But this is the value of the work that the researchers here are doing at the Knight Center and abroad across the United States. This is the essence of what life should be about. And so, though my grandparents lived with the disease, I had no clue that I would be propelled into this professionally. They're not here anymore, but I still feel a sense of urgency for us to not just find a cure, but truly make Alzheimer's disease a memory, something that we forget about. And I think we could do it. I think we're actually on our way. So when we look at how these drugs actually are working to modify the disease, what they're doing is attacking the biological markers or amyloid, and actually either making the body recognize it as a foreign object and attacking it or sweeping it out the brain. There's multiple different, very sophisticated mechanisms by which these drugs work. Unfortunately, though, the way we have to use them and administer them and get them to patients, it can certainly be a little bit cumbersome, because our symptomatic therapies, we could take them all orally. We also have patches, right? We have different things that we can do that aren't so caustic. But as we move into this next area of disease modification, we have to give it by infusion. Infusions that take a little while. Infusions that have to be given a couple times a month. Infusions that also bring along a lot of other issues. So when we look at some of these issues, they've got to have imaging to justify use, right? If they've had stroke or taken blood thinners, probably not going to be ideal unless the provider feels it's in their best interest. This intravenous administration, again, when we talk about access to care, people may not in rural areas have access to the nice centers that actually are providing these therapies. When we think about, again, this clearing of beta amyloid, we know that sweeping effect is beneficial, but it hasn't quite proven itself to be clinically valuable to the extent that justifies some of the hard work that I call these high maintenance drugs. You've got a whole lot to do to work up to qualify to get them, right? You've got to have beta amyloid on imaging and all kinds of different things. And then it's still not a cure, but it's a help. And the cost, who remembers how much aducanumab came on the market? Almost $60,000, $56,000, right? And then we had a little grumble and they knocked it down to $26,000. But some people don't make $26,000 in a year. So those same African American Hispanic patients that I talked about, a large number of them may or may not be able to afford the drug. And the problem with it is that the FDA requirements, for them to get it or CMS to cover it complicates it. If we're already not getting them to participate in a trial, imagine what that means in terms of health disparities, what that means in terms of us not being able to get these medications to the people most affected. So this is where I say I'm happy that they're on the scene, but again, we've got a whole lot to do, because when we look at the cost of care, certainly the costs are going up. But you know why the costs are going up? Now it's partially because of acquisition of drugs. When the symptomatic therapies came out, the biggest cost out of pocket might have been $140, $150 a month per patient. Okay, which is still, that was a lot. And we were, reaching out to patient assistance programs. Thank God the disease modifying therapies have patient assistance programs as well. But sometimes that could be a deal breaker, because just the paperwork associated with patient assistance programs for them to cover it for 3 months, then you have to reapply to get 3 months more, right? So it's a pretty tedious process, and if you don't have the literacy that goes along with that, if you don't have a cooperating or willing provider to vouch for salary and different things like that, again, all of these can become barriers to care in that regard. So even though we have all of these different things, when we look at what's happening, this was the slide I wanted you to appreciate what I was talking about. So we have more and more people getting Alzheimer's disease, the cost of care is going up, and look what's happened in terms of research funding. So that part is sad, right? And then we have more and more drugs that are on the market. So aducanumab is here, lecanemab is here. We have a lot of other disease-modifying therapies coming on the market. Now, they may not cost $56,000, but they're certainly not going to be $10,000 because it takes a lot. These are monoclonal antibodies. They're acting as immunotherapy. The route of administration, all of that feeds the cost. The healthcare professionals that are going to be required to administer it. So although we look very forward to this, and as I mentioned, we have 80% of the drugs that are being researched are considered disease modifying, you know, the question that we need to ask is it worth the cost? Well, I would still argue yes. I would still say yes. If no one else but for me. I need to be prevented. Right now, I'm only 27, so we need to make sure we get some things. So this is the other part of Alzheimer's disease that really compounds the cost. I remember my grandfather, bless his heart, he was a man. My mom would pay people to come, and when they weren't stealing her clothes and stealing her perfume, he was trying to touch them and be inappropriate because he was disinhibited. My grandmother, on the other hand, was aware she didn't remember my name, and so she would cry because she was depressed. She knew something was wrong, just didn't know quite what was wrong because everybody else was telling her something was wrong with her memory. She didn't recognize, she didn't know she wasn't remembering, right? But then when we found the towels in the refrigerator, or she'd go walking to her cousin's house down the street and the caregivers thought she was wandering, you know, but she had been doing that for 60 years, going to visit her cousin every day. And that got misinterpreted, you know, from a stranger who was having to take care of her. Or when she ended up in the nursing home and they forgot they needed to feed her, but they also needed to tell her to chew the food and then swallow the food. And by the time they realized she wasn't chewing and swallowing, she had a nice gum impaction. And unfortunately, she was bleeding from the gums, but bleeding vaginally also. She goes to the hospital and they discover that my grandmother had advanced stage ovarian cancer. And so we realized that maybe those tears may have been times she was in pain and couldn't express herself appropriately. So this is the kind of stuff that goes along with Alzheimer's disease. So I grieve because my grandmother probably was unfortunately suffering and didn't have to, but wasn't in a position to communicate her needs. And so that is a real big issue. So what happens when patients have these behaviors? A lot of drugs are thrown at them, antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, things that can make them more cognitively impaired, increase their risk for falls, or complicate their sleep, all kinds of things. And so this is where a pharmacist is needed. This is where a pharmacist can help. I'm not saying other disciplines can't do it, but what I am saying is that when we're added to the table, we can certainly make a meaningful difference because we can help filter through this and truly help guide appropriate treatment. So now that we have drugs like brexpiprazole on the market, we can more appropriately address some of these behaviors, but that's just one, and that's the first FDA approved. Do you know how many drugs have been used off-label to address these kind of behaviors? Right? And so this is why we have to continue doing the research. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Florida very, very quickly so I can stay on time. But I wanted to say in Florida, it's a snowbird state. We have a lot of people that come there to retire, to spend their nice days. And a lot of them, unfortunately, bring dementia with them. And we see them in the Neuroscience Bird Institute. We're evaluating them, or in our 17 memory disorder clinics. What I wanted to point out in this slide is the number of beds that we have in terms of nursing homes in comparison to ALFs. It's almost a 3 to 4 time difference, right? And I bring that up because we only have about 20-some-odd thousand pharmacists. Pharmacists are allowed to practice in nursing homes. We're required there. But in our assisted living facilities, there are no requirements garnering care there. And we do know in our assisted living facilities that medical practitioners aren't there on a daily basis, right? And so we have a really big disconnect. And so there's predictions of more people coming to Florida, more people having dementia, and so this is a big issue for us. And so when we talk about the costs associated with it, what we're seeing is that certainly a private room might be close to $100,000, and in this ALF it might be $48,000. So I told you, my grandmother made it in the nursing home, but my grandfather didn't. And that's what's happening to a lot of marginalized populations. They can't afford institutionalization. But it's those same behaviors that are driving family members, burning caregivers out, and driving family members to make hard decisions about the care of their loved ones. And so I've seen it, and it doesn't look very good. But this is unfortunately where all those costs come from, is the secondary institutionalization that's required for their continued care. So this is what and why pharmacists can help and make a difference at the Institute, at the memory disorder clinics. I've had the privilege of doing comprehensive med reviews and really trying to filter out all the past interference, get rid of the cognitive impairing meds, talk to caregivers about when to administer certain drugs. Let's avoid drug interactions here. Let's check on dosing and those kind of things. I had to do some of it in a telehealth model long before the pandemic. Some of it, most of it face-to-face, but individualized appointments just like the neurologist and everyone else. So I'm proud to say by the time I left Tallahassee, I had the biggest office in the clinic. We moved a couple times, but I had the biggest one, and we had postgraduates going through to kind of really help defray the cost. And these were some of the things that we did, in addition to exposing undergraduate students to this practice. When I moved to USF, we actually have our version of tomorrow's pharmacists. We have robotics, we have pharmacogenetic testing, and other things where we're able to actually help identify a risk, disease risk, and then try to do some things in regards to prevention, lifestyle modification, and education, and those kind of things. So it's been really exciting in that regard. One of the areas that we're actually embarking on is health literacy, recognizing that in our rural areas and also in the state of Florida, where we have a lot of immigrants, refugees, non-documented issued individuals, we have to really be mindful of health literacy because we can use all these high-tech terms and they don't sometimes get it. It doesn't connect the dots. So one of the things I'm excited about is that Healthy People 2030 actually has given a lot of focus to the importance of health literacy, and they've made it one of their primary areas that they're focusing on. And when we look at what they have proposed as focus areas, a lot of the things that they've identified are some of these lifestyle practices and issues that are risk factors for patients with ADRD. So I think if we all certainly give some attention to the importance of helping people realize that smoking and drinking come with consequences. Even though now we're entering an age where cannabis, we're appreciating the benefits and the limitations. So at the Institute, we have a running joke that we make the genetically modified rats for Alzheimer's research, but we have the outside rats, the community rats and mice, running up to the building because we have cannabis research. So we have a host of researchers who have proven the benefits of cannabis and propose that it may also sweep out beta amyloid. But again, because of federal regulations and things, we have to be mindful of the formulation. We have to be mindful of a whole bunch of other things. So that's the level of research that we're actually doing. But again, we see a lot of people, snowbirds especially, that come from states where cannabis is regulated differently than in Florida. Right now, it's just medicinally allowed for certain disorders. But when they come from Colorado, for example, where it's both medical and recreationally, license and then they come to us using it, we have to be like, hold on. There's a few drug interactions here that we have to be mindful of and other things. But this is the level of engagement that I've had to have with some of the patients that I've done. But I've been inspired in regards to the importance of health literacy too, because of its link to adherence and medication adherence. And this is just a study that actually looked at the fact that, that basically some of the major factors affecting adherence had to actually deal with either satisfaction with services, literacy, education level, et cetera, but the complexity of regimens. And so deprescribing, as I've mentioned, as one of the things that I've done has really been important. So if we can kind of clear up the complexities of healthcare for our patients, we can actually get better outcomes. And I apologize for the coloring, but what this basically said is that a lot of our emergency room visits, particularly with aging individuals, are related to health literacy issues and medication adherence issues. And so that's why that target population, you know, I've kind of prided myself in making sure that we work on that. So I'm not sure where we are. I got about 4 or 5 minutes. I wanted to tell you really quick a little bit more about our work with We Care and what we're trying to do to contribute to helping advance the need for more participation of minoritized people, because we do recognize that even though we create all these great drugs, if we don't know how they work in everybody, then we're doing a disservice to the process. And so our mission really is to try to close the gap of health disparities by helping with the recruitment of marginalized populations. But we work on both sides of the table. We talk to the researchers about the need for culturally tailored approaches to enhance recruitment efforts, to enhance retention efforts, right? And then we talk to the community about all of the different processes that are involved with this. And this is a lot of work because it requires us to work with a lot of people. So I'm so pleased to see the links here. And thanks in advance for my reception that you're hosting today. But I will say that the links in Florida also are our partners, and that we have done several virtual workshops with and numerous other. This just is a cross-section of our community partners, because we're a very small team, very intimate team. The dean, myself, and if I do go back a few slides, you'll see the dean is in the, this him, that's me. This is our community outreach people. And this is a student. And then this is one of our volunteers. She's now at Morehouse School of Medicine. And she graduated and moved on. I have no clue who these other people are, but they make, they make our slides look very pretty. But having said that, we reach out to a lot of community-based groups that share in their passion for health. Health. We all know health is our wealth. And so we do a lot of different things with them. Sometimes it's virtual workshops. Since the pandemic, of course, we had to pivot and do a lot of things virtually. But we were doing a lot of face-to-face things. And so these are individuals that are also part of our team that have helped us with community advocacy matchmaking, where we bring researchers in the community together and we talk about opportunities and we answer questions about research participation. Panel discussions, town halls, dialogues. We also have formed a community research review advisory board where we work with researchers and say, tell us your elevator speech and we will find the people for you. We'll go through our partners, our gatekeepers, our liaisons, our ambassadors, and we will have them help us get you research participants. We've established Research Match on campus so that we can help researchers not just deal with Alzheimer's disease, but the whole span of medical research. And so this has proven to be very rewarding and very effective. And COVID actually gave us a lot of opportunities because we connected that to Alzheimer's disease. We connected it to mental health. We connected it to all of the different cancers. But one of the other things that we discovered is that we needed to go back and revisit some of these issues, like the Tuskegee study and the Henrietta Lacks study, to give them a little bit more context, because there were a lot of people that unfortunately were very discouraged by what they had heard. But these are some examples of just some of the studies that we reviewed in the last 6 months, where they actually share with us marketing materials, and we send it out to our community, our database of people, and then we also follow up with them on the community side to see if they have any questions, et cetera. So we're really excited about some of the work that we've been able to do. We've also been able to deal with some of the issues that really become important for researchers to understand also about regarding implicit bias, et cetera. We have the conversations about why diversity is important and things that, you know, I'm sharing with you today in terms of what we need to do to help that. But as pharmacists, some of the things that I can really do is definitely help with adherence. And adherence doesn't just mean medication. It means with doctor visits. It means with lifestyle modifications. It means if they need help getting their medications paid for, we do what we have to do. But we have to connect them to the help. So when it comes to, again, patients that don't have transportation, we need to make sure that that's addressed before we start bugging them about participating in clinical trials. So those are the conversations that we're having with the community in hopes of trying to encourage retention, et cetera. And so these are just but a few of the strategies. We work with physician partners. We have a primary care community hub that serves as a connection point for primary care docs and their extenders, nurse practitioners, et cetera. We have pharmacy hubs, and they all advertise, again, the trials and things that we are actually reviewing through our boards to kind of help with that recruitment effort. And so, again, we actually have people who participated in trials share the story of their experiences so that they can do it. And then one of the things, again, we ask the questions through focus groups, you know, truly tell us what really is important to you and what are the background reasons why you don't want to participate. And we learn a whole lot, and sometimes it's passive, sometimes it's a little bit more interactive, but we try to do our best to have successful recruitment efforts. And so one of the things that we have really learned is that we have to earn trust in minority populations because they don't just automatically trust us. So how do you do that? Well, we have to emphasize, we have to understand, and it's interesting because the millennials may not know anything about the Tuskegee experience. They never heard it, or they did. You know, but there was a whole lot of other stuff that actually has. So when we're communicating with minority groups, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. Sometimes we have to address misinformation, especially during COVID. We had a lot of that. There were a lot of myths and things out there. We have to be mindful of the level of jargons and acronyms, have visuals where necessary, but definitely cultural competency, cultural humility training, sensitivity training. All of that is really important for researchers in training. And so we've definitely worked with like the Cobb Institute that has a program where they're working with researchers in training as well. But we try to be relatable and identify goals. And then when they do have questions about some of these hallmark situations that unfortunately have marred the reputation of clinical trials, we make sure that we're there as a trusted resource to kind of clarify. We are now planning a training for consumers to teach them about IRB processes and hopefully put them in a position to serve on community boards. Our two community relations contacts in our team actually have participated on IRB boards. And so we're trying to train the next generation of community individuals for that purpose. And we're doing that with our undergraduate pharmacy students also, so that they know they're responsible as well. So there's a lot, we could talk all day about some of these travesties, but we have to not try to pretend that it didn't happen. We have to be able to be transparent and be honest, but let them know the changes that have been made also. So it's interesting, you know, that we talk about trust and who it is that's not trusting. Actually, the majority of people that don't trust doctors and in the health system are Caucasian, but it's a lot more of them. But we do have enough still in our minority populations that we need to be mindful of. So just as a few closing thoughts, just wanted to say that the medical mistrust actually feeds a lot of why we don't see people running up to participate in clinical trials. Okay, so we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to realize that all of this, unfortunately, structural racism does contribute to their perception and willingness to want to actually done. The other thing that is really important is that we have to win back trust that may have been lost, and we didn't even know that it was actually lost. So there's a lot of things that we can do. This gentleman we work with at Moffitt, and we actually convened a group of seniors, and when it came to the COVID vaccine, they said, well, Tuskegee had nothing to do, really with why I didn't want to participate. What really bothered me was just the racism that takes place. And so we have to, unfortunately, own that and understand really the implications of what that means, that people want to be treated appropriately. And once they're treated appropriately and we win their trust, then they'll be willing to work with us. So these are, again, hard decisions that we have to make. So I want to thank you for your attention and the opportunity to talk to you today. And I don't know if we have 2 minutes. I just want to show you our We Care hype video if the technology will cooperate, but I might need some assistance because there it is. Let's see if it'll show you so you can see us in the community actually doing stuff. Nesting Sneed.
Well, why do we care? Why we care? Why this program? We want to improve health outcomes.
The collaboration between USF Health's Taneja College of Pharmacy's We Care program and Reach Up Incorporated aims to bridge the gap between underserved communities and access to care. We Care's mission is to increase the representation of diverse populations in clinical research. It starts with rebuilding trust between academic and clinical institutions through educating and empowering the community, and then providing research opportunities along with protection and advocacy for the participants.
They want to hear the story from folks who have been through a clinical trial.
You have to share all of that information with everybody.
So take the opportunity to have a better quality of life in our communities. Join us.
So with that, I will again thank you all for your attention today. Thank you for giving my life purpose and allowing me to share my purpose with you. I wish all of you luck as you aspire to make a difference in the world of research, but just know that you have a pharmacist that also is working really hard to help make your work more meaningful. So thank you so much for allowing me.
Let's see if there may be some questions.
I think we have time for a couple of questions if people have them. We have people in the on our team who have microphones, so if you raise your hand, they'll bring the microphone to you so you can ask your question. And they're very eager to take the microphone to somebody, so raise your hand. Right here, Stephanie Monroe.
I'm a big mouth, I think people can hear me.
Come on down, David, come on.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. So I guess this is sort of a personal question. I started working in Alzheimer's about 13 years ago, and then 3 years ago, my dad was diagnosed. And he, as a typical, I think maybe typical geriatric patient, has high blood pressure, he's got diabetes, he's been taking memantine for 10 years, don't know what it's doing, if it's doing anything, so we're gonna put him on a medication holiday. But his doctor's been very conservative, which I really appreciate. When we started going to her, and she's a geriatrician, he was on about 10 different medications. some of which were things he'd never been diagnosed as having, but she just wanted to. We're now down to about 7, and I'm hoping to go down further. But my question is about the whole issue of interactions. Number one, I guess I want to know, when you guys, when prescriptions are made, what kind of a collaboration, I guess, happens between the doctor writing the prescription and the pharmacist, if at all? Because what I've noticed is he takes literally 7 medications in the morning. There you go. He's on glimepiride, he takes that first, and then the rest of them all together. How is it possible that all of that is not impacting him? And when I asked the pharmacist, her response was, it's more important that he get them in him than that they necessarily work well. Just wanted your response.
That person was not a graduate from the universities that I've been at.
Walgreens.
Yeah. No, well, unfortunately, there's not as much communication as is needed between the prescription getting to the pharmacy. And it's complicated because your father having diabetes, he had probably somebody managing the diabetes, looking at his eyes, looking at his feet. If he had high blood pressure, the primary care doctor. And then if he had migraine headaches, he might have been seeing a neurologist. Well, they're not all talking, but they're sending medications to the pharmacy. Now, we should take the onus of helping you navigate when the appropriate time to take those medications are. We are doing things like making sure there's no duplication of therapy. The technology helps with a lot of that kind of stuff as well, and making sure the right amount, the directions are okay, the dose and all. But there's not enough, admittedly, there's not enough one-on-one conversation, me talking to him about that particular patient and what's in their best interest. There's a lot of room for improvement, but there's a lot more being done now in terms of interoperability between computer systems so that the pharmacist has more information on that patient at their fingertips. And so, but you're right, and unfortunately, your father and I'll be willing to work with you if needed to kind of help you navigate that, because that can be very daunting for the caregiver to try to figure out and navigate. So that's what does happen. They just put them all in there at one time. And yes, we want it all to get in, but we don't want unnecessary drug interactions or what we call medication-related problems, and that's what can happen when there's no insight and direction given. So I apologize that that's happened, that the healthcare system has failed you in that way.
Perhaps one more question?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. As a past caregiver for both my mom and my dad, I guess the thing that I would inquire about is what is it that we can do to help people, especially families of color, to understand that healthcare for the elders is a family affair, and that it's not something that they need to be quiet about, that if there's something that's needed or they don't know, that they should ask. It seems like it's when they get in that position that conversations begin to happen, when those conversations should have been happening all along. I was blessed in that my dad and my mom always taught me, if something happens to me, you gotta be my advocate. I don't know that everybody else did that, and there were many instances where I had to step in and say, wait, whoa, that's not his baseline, because people were giving him medications, for instance, that they didn't realize were negatively impacting him because their interactions had been limited with people like my dad, so therefore they thought what was happening was normal. So, how do we start to make it a community conversation about everybody's role and the importance of having that advocate there with that senior especially, or with the child, to ensure that things are happening that should be happening?
So that's exactly where We Care has tried to make a difference. So some of the partners you can appreciate on there include the faith-based community, other social, civic, Greek organizations, but others that have national health initiatives that need to get that messaging out. I think as health providers, though, we have to, despite cultural nuances, make sure we do diligence in encouraging people to prepare for the business of managing the aged population. There are cultural differences. And with Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, I watched a large degree of denial when it came to my grandfather exist almost too long, whereas on my grandmother, there was a little bit more sense of urgency. But some of those cultural pieces speak to why I was commenting on healthcare literacy and the need for us to get comfortable having some of these conversations that really make us feel uncomfortable. But proper preparation prevents poor outcomes in this regard. So early diagnosis and treatment, and I think if we start with knowing we have family history, I know I have family history. So getting those baseline tests and having someone else besides me know all my health history who can advocate for me. And for those of us that are fortunate enough to have that educational insight and advantage, we have to each one teach one so that it becomes culturalized, because I think this is Alzheimer's disease is not the only disease where people aren't talking and preparing the next generation on how to avoid some pitfalls. But you're right, there's a lot of unnecessary things. We're seeing people getting on the highway, going backwards, going the wrong way because people are afraid to take the keys away, and things like that. And so we've seen a lot of travesties happen because people aren't having the conversation. So we just have to step forward and have them. And in my family, we do have family meetings for that same purpose, just so that we can get it out in the open and talk about the elephant in the room. And more people probably need to start there and then lean on other groups that can kind of help them along the way.
So thank you very much. If there are additional questions, I'm sure that Dr. Hill will be happy to answer them individually to you, so don't hesitate to come and speak with Dr. Hill. But shouldn't we give her another round of applause? Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Now there is a reception outside hosted by the St. Louis chapter of Links Incorporated, so everyone can come answer questions and then go to the reception. Thank you all.